Okay. Okay. Hello, bonjour. Tansi, salam, chokma. Soho chafo John Hampton, Chikasha Saya, Executive Director Saya. Nahoba Pisachali. Jamaat Yakniutuko Yakuke Alani. That's in Chikasha Nampa, my language, that roughly, well, my ancestral language, that roughly translates into we say thanks to the people whose land this is. But that's in some ways a poor translation because Chickasaw ideology does not think of land as a possession. It might be closer to thinking, saying thank you to all those people in the group who are of this territory. So here in Treaty 4, we acknowledge the Nahiawak, Soto, the Sioux, or the Nakota, Dakota, Lakota, and we're also in the homeland of the Métis Nation, where this community came to be. And we're the home also of settlers, a site of migration and movement. So to acknowledge land is to acknowledge that it exists beyond us, that it's not something that's owned, but something that we are naming the caretakers of the territory here. Those who have lived here for time immemorial, who still do, and who will continue to long after you and I are gone, but not for lack of trying. So we're also here to talk about the work of Dawit Petros, work that asks us to examine how we speak about land, what land we consider available or unoccupied, and the histories of how nations claim ownership and attempt to shape territories into a particular image that's dictated from a distance. Some of you may be familiar with publications like Canada West magazine, which circulated images of Canadian prairies, vacant of peoples, here to attract homesteaders to settle in this territory, to feed expansionist aims, and then to literally feed the people of an ever-growing colonial empire. And this exhibition that we're here to celebrate helps situate that impulse in a larger global narrative of competing colonial projects. It helps spur insights into the way that we've been primed to think about land, what is erased, remembered, and carried forward. And I'm so happy to host it here in Saskatchewan, a province that Dawit once called home. I'm also very pleased to welcome Gaetan Verna, who will be providing some opening remarks. Gaetan, I think, as a guiding light in the Canadian arts community. She was appointed director of the Power Plant Contemporary Art Gallery in Toronto the same year that I've moved there, and I've long admired her tenacity and vision and that pivotal role she plays in connecting Canadian and international dialogue. So welcome, Gaetan.
Thank you so much, John. Good evening, everyone. I'm so thrilled to be here at the Mackenzie Art Gallery and thankful to you for welcoming us so warmly and joining us tonight for the opening of Dawit Petros' Spazio Disponibile in Regina. I'm excited that both Dawit and guest curator Irene Campolmi could be with us tonight, one physically and one virtually. It's heartwarming to be all together again in the same room after such a long time. I think back of when we first presented this exhibition at the Power Plant as part of our Winter 2020 season, and how the exhibition brought the gallery to life through an installation of serigraph, a photograph, sculptural work, a film, and soundscape. Spazio Disponibile, Italian for available space, scrutinize historical gaps in European and African cultural and colonial history. Dawit is an artist, a researcher, an educator focused on rereading the entanglements between colonization, migration, and modernism. The subject matter of his works come from lived experience. Dawit has spent his formative years in Eritrea, Ethiopia, Canada, Kenya, the United States, before settling to work and live between Chicago and Montreal. I'm grateful to our presenting sponsor, TD Bank, our lead donor, Lonti Eberts, and international arts partner, Istituto Italiano di Cultura Toronto, for their support in making this exhibition possible. I would be remiss in not taking a moment to thank my partners in crime in this incredible adventure, our guest curator, Irene Campolmi, and Dawit L. Petros. Thank you both for accepting my invitation, for working across ocean, pandemic, and all, etc., in order to support the exhibition, the symposium, the upcoming book, and the exhibition in its touring multi-form. Last but not least, I really want to thank the Mackenzie Art Gallery and its entire team, TACFAM, and also John Hampton and Crystal Mary. This is really important work, and it's reached by enabling us to present this exhibition here. It's reaching wider Canadian audiences. Now it's my honor to welcome your Associate Curator of Mackenzie Art Gallery, TACFAM, to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Gitan. And it's my pleasure tonight to also welcome our guest speaker who will be joining Dawit for this lovely conversation. We're about to have guest curator Irene Campolmi. Irene is a curator and a researcher based in Copenhagen, where for many years she has focused her work on performance, through which she has investigated post-colonial, queer, and feminist theories. Her research and practice have also concentrated on creating the conditions to apply ethics in curatorial work. Since 2019, Irene Campolmi is the head art program and curator of Enter Art Program, a publicly funded satellite program of performances and talk in conjunction with Enter Art Fair. Together with Copenhagen Contemporary, she has won the Bikuben Vision Award 2021, Denmark's most prestigious curatorial award, and as the lead researcher and curator of the exhibition and research project, It Moves. So everyone, please welcome Irene, who's sitting right behind me, and then right next to me, sorry, and Dawit L. Petros, who is joining us via Skype from Chicago. All right, so I think I'd like to kick off the conversation with, the first question. Why the title, Spazio Disponibile? What does that mean, and how did the project start for you both? Dawit?
Yeah, I'd like to begin, Tak, just very quickly by thanking everybody at the Mackenzie for making this exhibition possible. It's a real honor to have my work back in Saskatchewan, which is where I still call home. And I'm just, I'm sorry that I couldn't physically be there with all of you. Spazio Disponibile is a term that I first encountered in the pages of a magazine called Rivista Coloniale. It's an Italian colonial journal that ran from 1906 to 1943. And disponibile, as was alluded to earlier, means available, obtainable, or disposable. And I encountered disponibile paired with spazio, which means, which refers to the empty space in these journals that is available for advertisement. And so I was interested in how the combination of these two works could become a metaphor for the way in which Italian colonial thinking approached approached East Africa, Eritrea, and the African continent itself as an empty site which could be extracted, which could be owned, and which could be appropriated. And so as an exhibition title, it refers to this particular sort of journal, the source of this information. But in my work, it also refers to this attempt to, what does it mean to try and work with these spaces? Historically, between Italy and Eritrea, also within the present. So that's what Spazio Disponibile alludes to.
Well, I have nothing to add except that the whole idea also came in relation to
to the understanding of like the whole the Italian colonial project that always saw African territories, and especially in the Horn of Africa, where Eritrea and modern Eritrea and Ethiopia are located, like as available space. And this availability kind of like created the sort of like the leitmotif of the whole this interrogation of availability, and who's actually also allowed and entitled to, you know, be allowed to
be in that space.
Yeah, in that space, come from.
Yeah. And then understand that the content of the exhibition, even though, you know, like it's founded on, you know, historical research and research into archives, a lot of conversations are still very contemporary and very current as well, right? With the migrations, you know, that comes in as the, you know, the result of this legacy.
Well, do you want to start?
No, please, you go ahead.
Well, I mean, there is a whole. When we talk about Italian colonialism in the Horn of Africa, whether this is Libya, Eritrea, Ethiopia, we talk about a colonial project that in a way sort of like remained latent in the memory of the contemporary, you know, and the contemporary Italian history. What also we have, as Dawit said, Spazio Disponibile is a term that we encounter in the rivista. And the revistas were yearly published magazines that were like accounting for what was happening in the colony. Whether this was like to invite Italians to come and become settler in the colonies, or whether this was more like also to provide new business, you know, or advertise new business for the Italians in Italy. So the whole idea of also the work that Dawit has done with the rivista was to mark the numbers of years that the Italian colonial project actually took place as a part in Eritrea. So to mark also the length of this domination, of this occupancy, and versus what is the current rhetoric and what has been the rhetoric for many years, that Italians are not colonizers, that Italians didn't occupy the Horn of Africa for a long time. It was just part during the fascists, and it's not like that. It's actually something that really starts in mid of the 19th century. I don't know, David, if you want to add more.
I think what I would add is this relationship between, forgive me my power, the relationship tacked between historical events and the contemporary context. Between 2014 and 2017, I spent a great deal of time traveling in and around North Africa and Southern Europe. And it was at the moment when the West was ingesting a lot of these types of images. And so what's interesting about this photograph that says, the caption, African refugees on a crowded boat 25 miles from the Libyan coast. I was interested in how this kind of language, both linguistically and photographically, denied this history that Irene is talking about. The fact that the African in this image, right, this large category fails to differentiate Senegalese, Cote d'Ivoirians, Ghana, Nigerians, Eritreans, Ethiopians, Somalis, and it purports to present an unfamiliarity between Eritreans, specifically what I'm interested in, East Africans and Italians. And so I was interested in doing the type of historical exploration that could say the conditions that produce this distance in the contemporary actually are not substantiated historically. And so this excavation, as Irene has said, of this long-standing period of colonialism is to say, actually, Italians are deeply intimate and familiar with East Africa. And so this image tries to hide that kind of relationship by lumping all of these departures from North Africa into one appellation. And so part of what the project is really invested in doing is to say, what are the conditions that produce this kind of image, and how do I articulate the effect of this kind of photograph in the present?
And if I may also add something that we do your work, I think that an image like the one that you are presenting today kind of tap into what we have discussed many times, the fact that in the Italian rhetorics there is a sort of like denial of the status of migrant. So for many years, especially in the years that you mentioned, 2016, the far-right movement was, and the government in Italy was denying like migrants, the status of migrants to be even like welcome in the Italian territory, and it sort of tapped into what has actually been the history of the formation of Italy as a nation. It's an history of migration, and an history of people migrating, people leaving the country.
Yeah, and I think here, yeah, and this is where one of the things that is central to this entire exhibition and to the research that informs this exhibition are these sorts of narratives, the contemporary movement of East Africans through North Africa into Europe through Italy. So in my work, I refer to a triangle. This is one corner of that triangle. The other corner of this triangle is this historical period, when Italians had established a colony in North Africa, in Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia. So this moment in time when Italians are moving south, moving from southern Italy into North Africa and East Africa. This is the second part of the triangle. And the other part of the triangle is what Irene was just alluding to here, which is the large emigration. 27 million Italians emigrated to all corners of the world between 1876 and 1976. And what I'm interested in doing through my work is to bring these three elements together. To say we cannot look at the emigration of Italians to Canada, for example, without understanding the colonial settlement of Italians into Africa and the contemporary movement of East Africans into Italy. So this is this triangulation. So it's this kind of historical analysis that I'm insisting is necessary to understand the contemporary movements of young Eritreans, Ethiopians, Somalis into Europe through Italy.
And I think historically, I mean, what is interesting also to emphasize is the fact that that this whole movement towards East Africa, towards North America, they all come from in a moment, you know, in the mid of the 19th century, when Italy almost like, you know, becomes what is like the first kingdom in 1861, and become the nation that sort of like we call Italy, but that didn't exist. They didn't have like a population. It didn't have a language. It didn't have a system. It didn't have even a financial structure. It didn't have nothing. And that's exactly sort of the moment in which we start seeing these migratory movements towards the outside, and that's also where the colonial projects start.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly, Irene. So this sense of the formation of Italy is so dependent on these three vectors, right? On these two vectors, and so I'm trying, you know, so this insistence on these histories as that the space between these histories isn't what is customarily sort of understood to be. So this is the historical. So these are the three nodes. This is the triangulation.
So what are some strategies that you used in producing the exhibition, you know, to like emphasize this gap in memories?
Yeah. The first one is I will show in this photograph here. Part of it is to bring two geographical spaces and two two temporal spaces, like two different times and two different geographical spaces together. So in the image on the image on the left, what you see is simply a contemporary subject who's moved south to north, holding an image of Italians moving in the other direction. So that's what is happening in the photograph on the left. And then on the right is another image, which is actually where the Spazio Disponibile sort of spread comes from, is sort of this historical image held and interrogated by a subject who, as I said, has moved south to north. But the other strategy is we're now looking from Europe towards Africa. And this is not a perspective that is generally conceived of. So the other strategy here is to reverse the orientation of looking, so that Europe just doesn't become the singular direction in which movement moves to, but it just, you collapse it onto itself so that movement away from it is also is also looked at in the same vantage point. And then another strategy here is, and I will let Irene sort of talk about this one, is taking these forms of historical sort of material, cutting them up, increasing their scale, changing their relationship so that they do a different work. So what I've done here is taken a small publication which initially read La Questione Africana. And it's the sense in which the Italians are asking themselves at this historical moment, is like, what are they going to do with like this African question? Right? It's almost like a problem, but it's a problem whose solution is absolutely essential to formation of what becomes Italy itself. So to make the work, I've simply taken the letters of La Questione Africana, revised the order a little bit, and generated La Questione Italiana. And so this act of mirroring brings these unresolved historical questions in relationship to one another.
I think what is interesting also in this work, Dawit, is another, connection to the formation of Italy as a nation state, and the whole problems that this also create. In your work, I mean, the blowing up this the cover of the La Questione Africana, the African question, it was basically a book cover of a small pamphlet that published in 1888 was really unfolding, like, why are we colonizing Africa, or why we should colonize Africa. And the writer is actually an Italian geographer that was working for the state in order to sort of like map the whole country, or the whole territory, modern country, and decide and sort of suggest whether the Italian colonial project should extend over those territories or not. And it's interesting the way in which you have worked with kind of mirroring, this question that the Italian state is trying to resolve. Should we go there in a way? Like La Questione Africana means like, should we go to Africa? That's like the sort of like main large question. And the other side is like the Italian question. I found very interesting the way in which you have sort of manipulated this whole existing sort of pamphlet, creating an extension of potentially another pamphlet, which is Gramsci, the Southern Question. Antonio Gramsci in the pamphlet, The Southern Question, La Questione del Sud, interrogates why, it's published later, it's published in the early 20th century, but it's asking exactly like the problem of the Italy as a nation state is that it doesn't exist until it doesn't resolve its unpacked, unsolved problem with including the south of Italy that has always been under another sort of like basically like a project or kingdom, which was the Bourbons, and sort of included in it, because the problem with the south has always been to be marginalized as any other sort of like geographical south. And what you have done with this is exactly by bringing bringing into the conversation Gramsci, but also sort of alluding to his question, you kind of mirror the fact that the African question, the desire or the need, actually, the economical need is becoming a colonial force is interdependent and interconnected with the internal need of creating a nation state that didn't even wasn't even like ready to create, didn't even have the resources of dealing with its own internal problems. And what I found also very interesting, and maybe we can tap into the conversation now, is the fact that in your work you have Sammy holding the a contemporary photo of the Spazio Disponibile, and then you have Hali holding an historical photographs of Italian as basically being settler in Libya in 1932 and trying to occupy, what is like a virgin in a way, or like completely almost desert space. And you do this in Catania, in the south of Italy, exactly where, in a place that historically, or in a geographical location that historically has been neglected by what has always been the Italian, what has been like the Italian government. And so it's interesting the way in which your work sort of like, reflect historically also on this southern migration, but also like in which you bring this southern question, which is the also Italian question in your work, also on the contemporary, in the present tense.
No, absolutely. So the extent to which I think the Italian colonial project is so distinct from everything else, and I think one of them is this point that you're bringing up, Elena, is the extent to which it has its own internal colonial unresolved question, right? Which is the relationship of the agrarian South in relationship to the industrialized North, and how these questions now play themselves out with the arrival of many of the migrants who are now doing a lot of that same backbreaking labor, right? So yeah, so it's, yeah.
And what about the, before Irene, what about the curatorial engagement, the curatorial strategy that you've been using for, at each iteration of the show?
Well, I feel like I have to say that I'm as curating as Dawit is curating, and that's actually a plus that has really come out of this kind of like long-term collaboration. I think then something that Dawit has always brought into the conversation is the necessity of always approaching the material, archival material, but artistic material, always from a different perspective. So always trying to create a different vantage point, a different viewpoint, so that ourselves, in the first place, we would look also at the material differently, adding nuances to that. So on that side, the only thing that I can say is that we wanted to create more than a circular sort of like exhibition. We wanted to sort of like have the audience, especially in relation to the Mackenzie art galleries, entering with facing an aspect exactly that is very crucial in Dawit's research, which is that the colonial project brought to Eritrea what we could see and what we could call modernity, infrastructures, roads, cable cars, jobs, leisure time, cinema, car industry, brought what in Europe was, so to say, but also in maybe in North America, was really called like the modernity. But the interesting part is that Italy didn't have a modern time per se on its own. It happened at the same time, and because it had the opportunity of creating and shaping this identity in relation to its own also colony. So we need to understand Italy as this lone nation. There's just like little bits and bits of reigns of like kingdoms. So it is interesting that the exhibition, especially at the Mackenzie, begins with this aspect that the Eritrean modernity is interdependent to the Italian modernity, and this is already like the most complex aspect of, I think, of the show that we are presenting also in the show, right? So
yeah, I think the thing that one of the things that I try to be sensitive to, and we've spoken about extensively, Irene, but I've also spoken about it with you, Tak, has been each exhibition venue presents an opportunity to rethink the material that is in the exhibition. So as much as the exhibition really asks the spectator and the viewers to think about these questions of historical and contemporary mobility, the artwork also is its own migrant. The artwork is also engaged in a nomadic exercise in that the power plant presented very particular opportunities that could not be replicated in Buffalo. Buffalo could not be replicated at the Mackenzie. And so I think that challenge of attuning oneself to the possibilities of a space and how the relationship to the work can produce something which is a surprise for me, and hopefully, and a surprise for Irene as well. So that movement across the boundaries of various exhibition spaces. The exhibition is traveling from Canada across an international border to the United States and back. So this kind of thinking for me is very, very important. And within the language of the exhibition itself, so the key concern for me is that we have sculpture, we have film, we have moving image, we have still images, there's a range of language, and part of this is also another meditation on migration. Sort of really thinking about, in these images here, I'm asking the viewer to think about where photography brings us to. Photography brings us to the edge of vision. It shows us certain things, but it makes us really aware of what we don't see. And the rest of the language in the exhibition, all of these other forms that we're talking about, are there in order to invite participants and viewers to the show to think about how ideas also migrate across these boundaries of aesthetic form. So this movement, and this interrogation of movement, happens at multiple levels.
And I think it's interesting also what you just emphasized, the fact that you work with different medias, also to bring the complexity, to bring up, to bring up to the surface the complexity of telling history from different perspectives. So that it's not just in a written form. So it's not just like a visual content, but it's sound, but it's ghostly presence, it's vanishing points, it's moving image, and it's much more.
Yeah. So that the subjects, the collaborators, the figures holding images, they're archives. The building, the Casa d'Italia, which figures centrally in this film of this Italian community center, Montreal, that's an archive. These bits and pieces of songs that I use, these bits and pieces of voices that I use, those are archives. So on the one hand, my investment in photography, which is where all of my artistic explorations historically begin, is both because of the faith that I have in photography to tell us something about the world, but to also remind us that we have to call into question its authority at the same time of using it. And so to Irene's point, curating or working in a framework that really allows the full senses, the hearing, the seeing, the objects off the wall, three-dimensional, the objects on the wall. So all of these ways of really sort of reminding us that the more languages we use to investigate the question, I think the better opportunity we have to develop an understanding of particular things.
Yeah, thank you. And you just mentioned this film, this two-channel film that you have created for the exhibition as a study. Personally, I find it embodies a lot of the thematics that have been brought up in tonight's conversation. This movement of migration, this complexity, this triangulation. Could you speak a bit more about this piece?
Yeah, the film is a really important element in that it's really the one piece that it's the one work that is a stand-in for this larger Italian-Canadian migration dimension that I've been talking about. It's a 2-channel film installation centered on this building that you see in the on the slide. It's a community center that was built by the Italian community in Montreal, by Italian immigrants in Montreal in 1936. And it's a 2-channel film, so that you have images, text, voice that moves back and forth between these 2 screens. So that kind of mirroring that Irene was referring to there also happens in this film. And what we have happening in the film is there is a voice speaking in Tigrinya, and it is the interlocutor who's the gentleman by the name of Petros, who's speaking in Italian and really examining the architectural syntax of this building in Montreal. And what he's doing is he is pointing out the fascist iconography, the fasces. There's a stylized fasci in the sun, Italian sort of fascist sun symbol in the building. There are all of these architectural syntaxes that refer to the project of fascism. But what he does is he uses this language to compare and contrast to buildings in Asmara in Eritrea. And he then sort of moves on to sort of talk about, to question why it is that Italians have forgotten their colonial spaces, Eritrea, Italy, sort of Ethiopia. And so part of what the film does is sort of, on the one hand, we have this analysis of this architectural syntax, and then we have this camera that acts like a migrant, exploring the language, interior, exterior of this space. And all of a sudden, space between Montreal and Eritrea sort of collapses, right? And so the complexity of what Irene was talking about earlier, which is Italian emigration to Canada, Italian colonization in East Africa, and Italy as its own unresolved Italian question, all of these ambiguities come to the surface. And so we realize that the stories that we're conventionally asked to consume about one or another of these aspects are not indivisible. Are not divisible. But they have to be considered in relationship to one another. So that's what this film. That's what the film does. That's what the film is. Excuse me.
And I think, but just one thing, I think what's also interesting in the film, all at one point, that they Casa Studies, that's the whole title, that actually refers to like Italo Calvino's, short
No,
story.
please finish that. That's very important. Please finish.
No, but you can tell about this. But I wanted to refer like that the voice that we hear describing these buildings, as Dawit said, speaks a fluent Italian. As a native speaker, I feel like that I feel the sort of like the short circuit also of like hearing this voice, then also talking sometimes in nostalgic and melancholic sort of tones about the more than the Italian domination, about the Italian presence, and this fact that even if that it's sort of like that this sort of Italian presence stays even after Italy lose or is no longer like in charge of Eritrea and Ethiopia as in its colonial projects. And I felt that it was very. I've always felt very that these kind of like nostalgic tones really emphasize the complexity of what we are talking about, because it's neither or. It is a something that is larger, and it's larger also in relation to another work that you have done in relation to the architectural buildings that are exactly constituting the cartography, the whole urban planning of Asmara. Asmara as a little Rome, and Asmara as we mentioned also before, as a city that has, in a way, refunctionalized these spaces that were constructed during the colonial period. So how do we deal also with the spaces that contain these layered histories and that have been also refunctionalized? So it's quite, I think, in your work, what we really feel is the complexity of like we understand that it's necessary to use different vocabularies for narrating integrated histories in relation to colonialism and from both sides, the colonizers and the colonized perspective.
And I think in that sense, I'm sorry, if we could just very quickly, I skipped past this image. I share this image, which is Italian laborers working in infrastructure projects on the left. And so the labors that we see in these images are coterminous. And so here we have on the left Italians building the infrastructure, right? So establishing the modernist sort of nation that the left, and then Italians as colonizers on the right. Right? And so the extent, like that's kind of ambiguity that I was just alluding to a second ago, right? So the way in which, as you I think so nicely put it, Irene, it's not a neither nor, but that these things are happening at the same time, and so we're asked through these kinds of images to understand like the complexity and the ambiguity and the ambivalence of these kinds of relationships.
Well, thank you for sharing with us the stories and the research that you've done behind beautiful and so rich exhibition. I'd like to make sure that our audience have an opportunity to ask some questions. Do you have any questions in the audience for either Dawit or Irene? Yes, Timothy?
Yeah, thank you very much. That was fascinating. And one of the things I'm interested in is how this exhibition functions here in design. One of the things about colonialism is that it's very dramatic enterprise. The Italian colonialist enterprise is a mirror of other European nations, and here we have British imperial presence, which is in itself a kind of a mirror historically of Roman imperial efforts going through. And that all comes together here in Regina on a bridge, where we have a Egyptian style bridge combining the elements of Egypt as the great basket of the Roman Empire with establishing the great basket of the British Empire. I'm just wondering, if you could talk about how that sense of nomadic desire to imitate other empires plays into your thinking about this particular constellation of imperial ambitions in Italy.
Wow, that's a great question. Thank you so much. Timothy, I hope I got all of that. But I just quickly want to sort of mirror, so I'm certain that I've heard it, it's this relationship between what you're calling the mimetic sort of function of Italian colonialism in relationship, say, to the British, etc., and then the specificity, how these questions play out within the specific location of Regina. Do I sort of have right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so two things, and I'm so glad that you've asked this question, and I'm going to sort of answer them in reverse. There is a huge population, East African, Eritrean, Ethiopian, both in Regina and around Saskatchewan. So part of what is really, really sort of essential for me is for us to encounter these questions that many of us were not taught. Like a lot of these histories I'm learning on my own. And to bring these questions into the settler colonial context so that as Eritreans, as Eritrean Canadians, we are also implicated in our presence in a place like Regina. So that that colonial question that was quote unquote sort of historically behind us is not a resolved sort of question. And so that we have to engage with, in a sense, our complicity within the settler colonial present. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think it's really important, Timothy, to say that Italian colonialism is not mimetic. It's not exactly like British or exactly like the French. In that, as Irene was talking about earlier, Italy was an incredibly poor country. So that its imperial project, which was an attempt to occupy the same kind of imperial sort of power as the French, as the British, as the Germans, as the Portuguese, as the Spanish, was quite specific. I mean, it was really, really quite specific. And another thing that also makes it quite distinct is that all of those other colonial contexts, they have had, in a sense, the post-colonial reckoning. The Caribbeans, West Africans, sort of the Caribbeans, the Jamaicans, who have, the former subjects of the British colony who have come to England, former Algerians, Moroccans, the former subjects of the French Empire who have come to the metropole. That hasn't happened with Italy. And so to go back to the image that I showed at the beginning, which you have an Italian photographer who creates this image that presents this African totality. The post-colonial, the return of the repressed colonial question is happening now within the context of Italy. And so my investment in pointing to these specific features of Italian colonialism is to say, if we say it is like everything else, then it means that the colonial question has been dealt with in it, and it hasn't. So it's more accurate to describe this repressed colonial, the relation between Italy and the past as displaced, right? So that it's deliberately being sort of not looked at. And in the place of that, you have these myths, brava gente, we were colonialists. We were there for a short period of time. We were benign when there were monstrous acts of violence, egregious violence that had been accounted for. And so to now bring all of these questions back into Regina within the context of Canada is to say, as Canadians, as Eritreans, within that context, here is where I think the question of dare I say, responsibility comes to effect. I think to ask this question in that context means that there is a relationship between these colonial frameworks, but not that they replicate each other in the exact same way.
If I may add also something, Dawit, and also to your question, Timothy, there is also an interesting aspect in the scope or of what sort of the initial scope, the initial justification of the Italian colonial projects, which wasn't coming from, you know, building infrastructure. So what you are mentioning about Italiana brava gente, Italians, really good people, is that their rhetoric, their excuse has always been, and that's, you know, that's also what also brought them as a whole population of, to sort of forget and forgive themselves, is that they have built a lot of infrastructures. They have done a lot of good things like building like buildings and so on and so forth. So that was always sort of in a way justified and covered the abuses, the illegal and also non-human operations conducted in the territory. And it's quite, interesting because that's I see parallelism in the, for example, in the Danish colonial project that comes from a different perspective than Italy, because actually Denmark, in the same period that this is happening, was actually a large colonial country. But exactly, it's in the scope that then the aftermath of the memory, and the initial scope that sort of justified the initial movement, that then the memory also keeps being preserved. And that's exactly that mechanism that I think your work is really reversing. You are twisting the way in which, through the material that you are bringing also, you are really twisting the whole understanding of the Italian colonial project, reversing, the initial scope of going to colonizing East Africa, the Horn of Africa.
Yeah, and I think the final thing that I would add to that, is the other specific dimension in terms of how this work reads in Canada is also the fact that it's something that I'm looking at in this current sort of the continuation of this project, is the way in which Eritrea, East Africa, were always intended for the Italian colonial project as the outlet within which you can stop this massive hemorrhage of Italians to, in this case, sort of Canada, to other parts of the world. And so, in the Italian imagination, the parts of the Horn were conceived as the outlet within which you're going to stop this movement and redirect it to this other space. And so to bring these questions into, to bring these unresolved colonial questions into the Canadian context, reactivates these questions that haven't, I believe, been properly interrogated.
Thank you for the answer, Dawit and Irene. Thanks, Timothy, for the question. Unfortunately, we're out of time this evening, but such a rich and exciting, intriguing conversations, and I hope that we have more opportunities in the future to continue these conversations that are very, very important and very current. So the exhibition Dawit L. Petros, Spazio Disponibile, is officially open at the Mackenzie, and it will be on view until April 3rd, 2022. So if you're around, please come check it out. And and we see you next time for our other event in the near future. And for folks who are joining us here in the theater, I'd like to remind you that we have a live small reception in the cafe following the closing of this event. So before we adjourn for tonight, I would like to send a warm thank you to the team at Mackenzie for coming through and in organizing this event tonight, and also in helping installing the exhibition upstairs. Sorry, just some names I need to. Thanks. So I'd like to thank John Hampton, Chris Amori, Timothy Long, Maria Olinik, Brenda Smith, John Riker, Livon Delorme, Larissa Bushley Cleland, Corey Bryson, and Christy Ross for tonight's support. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good evening.
And I should say thank you for having us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mackenzie and Galen, for having us.